Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Making Research Accessible and Meaningful to Practitioners. This is part of the OER Professional Development Series of the Office of Education Research at the National Institute of Education, Singapore. My name is Philip Towndrow, and I will be your moderator and discussant for this morning. Today we have four very interesting, unique, but connected presentations about making research accessible. Before we get to the first presentation, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping matters, and then we'll be able to get started. So the first thing is that we will be presenting from the presenters, we have a live Q&A stream, which you will be able to see on the right-hand side of your screens in a separate box. If you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel at the end of the presentations, then please enter your questions there. We will collect everybody's questions, trying to identify common themes, and then I will pose those questions on your behalf to the panel members during the discussion. So we welcome your questions and your participation, and we look forward to learning with you and learning from you as we go through the discussions. Now, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar this morning, then we have technical staff that are with us who will be able to help you. We also have an email address that you can write to, and you can see that on the screen right now, prodevelopment.committee@nie.edu.sg, and you can submit your questions and queries about the technical aspects of the webinar there if you need any help. So I'll have some more announcements at the end of the presentations and the end of discussion, but I'll leave those until later. So first then, let me introduce the first panelist this morning. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Associate Professor Dr. Mark Belden to the floor. He is an Associate Dean for Partnerships and Analytics in the Office of Education Research at the National Institute of Education, which is part of Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's also Associate Professor in Humanities and Social Studies Education and has taught social studies in schools in the United States, Israel, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and Taiwan. His research and teaching are focused on global citizenship education, inquiry-based pedagogies, and new literacies. He's currently interested in examining ways to enhance research impact, knowledge brokerage, and educational partnerships. And so now let me pass the time over to Mark, and he can begin his presentation. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil, and good morning, everyone. Phil, is everyone able to see my slides? I'm assuming that's the case. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity to share a knowledge framework that we've been working on in the Knowledge Mobilization Unit. And what I want our presentation to do is to really think about the role of knowledge in making research accessible and meaningful for practitioners. So just to give you a bit of an overview, I'll talk a little bit about the background and purpose of the knowledge framework, also some knowledge challenges and opportunities. I'll also share some core concepts that are key to understanding the knowledge framework. Then I'll share the knowledge framework and finish by talking about how we can move forward to partner with practitioners to co-produce knowledge. So to begin, just a little bit of a background. We see that making research both accessible and meaningful is become really core to the work that we do at NIE. It's expected to inform decision-making in both practice and policy. It's central to our educational funding program and to NIE's strategic vision. And the purpose of developing the framework was really to provide strategic vision to be able to coordinate and mobilize NIE knowledge, expertise, and partnerships in order to strengthen the research, policy, practice nexus. So we really are moving this forward to try to support priorities in the education system, like full subject-based banding, skills future for educators, and networked professional development. So if we think about knowledge, there's several challenges that we're faced with. One is that there's multiple forms of knowledge. If we think about professional knowledge, it comes in multiple forms, and a lot of times there's leakage and fluidity between these different categories, like content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, assessment literacy. And so it makes it very difficult to track knowledge and to understand the extent to which it actually is accessible and meaningful and useful for different audiences. And we also have difficulty assessing the use and impact of research knowledge. A lot of times we produce research and are not quite sure what kind of impact or effect it has in terms of changing behavior in classrooms or beliefs or just even awareness. There's also the power-knowledge relationship, that sometimes certain kinds of knowledge are privileged over other forms of knowledge, and typically they're shaped by dominant discourses and organizational logics and so on. And we see that there are still existing knowledge silos. There's the silos between university and schools, but even between different disciplines as well. And then the relationships between research, practice, and policy are not necessarily causal, linear, or rational, and these are always socially negotiated. So again, knowledge work is oftentimes messy and difficult to track. And I think to go deeper into this idea of the knowledge challenge, we see a little bit more in more detail if we go from left to right on this table. The nature of knowledge, the source of knowledge, and knowledge contexts are different across research and practice knowledge. So if we think about research knowledge, it tends to be analytical, propositional, and theoretical. It's more around knowing that and knowing why. So it's trying to understand what is happening, for example, in classrooms, and understanding, kind of theorizing why these things happen. It's also highly generalized. It's meant to be generalizable, and it's abstract, tends to be impersonal and critical. It's formal. We spend a lot of time focusing on arguments that are well supported by evidence, and we tend to focus on specialized expertise. So there's a longer time frame where we're looking quite carefully and deeply into particular kinds of problems using rigorous methods and so on. And it's shaped by university metrics that focus on things like, publishing in high impact journals, citations. But if we look at practice knowledge, it tends to be more normative, tends to focus on what ought to happen, perhaps, in classrooms. It's also procedural and technical. It's about knowing how. And it's very context specific, and it tends to be personal and relational. It's based in experience, classroom experience. And if we, again, use Aristotle's categorizations of knowledge, it's focused on phronesis, which is this notion of practical wisdom. It's thinking about the wisdom that's necessary for very practical action in the classroom. And it tends to be more broadly focused on the range of problems in classrooms with classroom practice. And it tends to be shaped, if we look at the context, it's shaped by system and school imperatives. And it's very solutions oriented. It's meant to address pressing concerns and more immediate types of concerns. And so there's a need to really focus on, how can we address the problem tomorrow when I walk into the classroom, that kind of idea. But I think one of the things that might be helpful is to think of this more on a continuum. And if we look at both ends of this continuum, and actually, as I was thinking about this, it might be more helpful to think about this as a circle in some ways. But at one end of the continuum, we see this sort of research-based knowledge, which is based on using scientific method. And at the other end is knowledge that's based on professional experience and this notion of craft wisdom or practical wisdom. It's the knowledge that's accrued over time through practice and through experience. But I think one thing that might be helpful is to really think about that sweet spot in the middle, in that if we really want to make research accessible and meaningful, then we might want to move towards a model of co-produced knowledge where we're working together. So it's more around this sort of notion of researcher practitioner engagement, or a notion of engaged scholarship with collaborative inquiry that focuses on shared problems and mutual interest, the mutual interest of improving educational practice, for example. And it's about making classrooms and schools as sites of both experimentation and investigation, and really thinking hard about how we can bridge that sort of research practice gap to really link up these different forms of knowledge, to bring different perspectives to bear on different kinds of problems that we're looking at together. Just as a quick recap, our own Ung Pakti has written about the power of paradoxes. So focusing on these problems and paradoxes of practice are the creative tensions that can really drive change. And so really moving forward, how do we join research and practice knowledge to improve education? It's really about the engagement between researchers and practitioners, developing knowledge building relationships and cultures, focusing on common problems of practice, situating it in schools and other professional communities of practice, and really transforming research knowledge into very practical actions and resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the core concepts that are mentioned in the last slide. So I think to think about knowledge, it's helpful to understand the concept of knowledge mobilization. So if we want to make research really useful and accessible and very meaningful, it's really about producing useful knowledge with our stakeholders. So it's generating knowledge as needed to suit particular purposes and contexts to make it really useful. A knowledge translation is, again, creating accessible knowledge to support evidence-based decision making. So it's a focus on the utilization and uptake of the research knowledge. So better understanding those translational processes and how we can make some of the research knowledge more practical and usable is core to this idea. Another concept is knowledge brokerage, where we see individuals and institutions acting more as mediators and intermediaries to really connect up these different forms of knowledge. And then the last concept here that's important is this notion of research impact literacy. And it's understanding, assessing, and being able to articulate impact. And I think part of that literacy is really understanding user needs, whether they be policymakers or teachers, and how different forms of knowledge might actually benefit different stakeholders. And the other aspect of impact literacy is it's the practices necessary to create impact. So it's really thinking more about how do we create relevant, usable, impactful knowledge resources? How might we broker and translate knowledge? And how might we co-produce knowledge with stakeholders? So this is the knowledge framework, and I'm going to take you through it. It might seem quite complex, but if you see our guiding principles, they really address some of the core problems and ideas that I've mentioned in the previous slides. We really want to connect up research and users. It's based on mutualism and being responsive. It's more of a social process. It's more about the social construction of knowledge with stakeholders, about co-creating new knowledge for change. It's problem focused and so on. If we think about the different units that we have within OER, for example, these units will work together following these kinds of principles. And this is the kind of the heart of the framework here. And so we see in the middle circle, it's kind of this notion of nested knowledge. We see where there's a focus on the knowledge production and management. So our knowledge mobilization unit has typically worked on, kind of managing that knowledge in terms of curating it and connecting it as needed. But if we move up, we see that knowledge translation is again focused on making it accessible and usable. And then knowledge brokerage is this sort of engagement and connection between different stakeholders and researchers. And we think that this can really enable the system when we focus on knowledge and the ways that it can be used to build knowledge and build theory and so on. We want the knowledge mobilization unit to work across this, all the way from the production and kind of the planning for impact, all the way to the use in classrooms. And again, we have we want to give stakeholders access to useful resources and link, exchange, and engage with different stakeholders. And it's really focused on the idea of capacity building. So if we see from on the left-hand side, it's enabling access, but it's also helping people make sense of and applying knowledge in different ways. And then really improving knowledge use and decision making. So making sure that they have the knowledge that they need just in time to be able to make decisions, whether it's in classroom practice or in the policy as well. And this can have an influence on the wider context of innovation and knowledge building. And then if you see on the left-hand side, we're wanting to move from sort of a linear dissemination of knowledge from producers to users to one that's a model of knowledge that's focused on the co-production of knowledge. And so moving from kind of just the right-hand side, from just informational functions to more relational, and then to system and knowledge building functions. So this is a knowledge framework to help researchers and practitioners think about how they might be able to work together here to co-produce and to really focus on some of those system capacity building and knowledge building functions. And I think just in terms of moving forward, I have a few suggestions. We've been starting to have discussions with people like David Phipps at York University in Canada, who we really see as leaders in this field. But it's really focusing on this idea of developing NIE's impact literacy. Again, I think right from the planning of research all the way to following it up in terms of how users are making use of research, there needs to be, I think, some capacity building that we can focus on here in terms of mobilizing research for impact and developing individual researcher capacity as well as the capacity of the overall institute. We also think that situated professional development and collaborative inquiry is key to this. And so really developing sustained partnerships that can be impactful to look at problems of practice collaboratively. And that happens best in classrooms and in schools. So it would be very situated. And then we have a couple of small projects where we're looking at how our partners use research knowledge. So we want to better understand how impact happens. So if we share research and share knowledge with different stakeholders, how are they making use of it? What do they find useful and helpful? And we want to enable diverse knowledge pathways, that we think that there's a range of ways that knowledge can traverse and connect up. So we want to explore that as well. And then the last couple of suggestions is thinking about impact indicators. Again, thinking about the challenges that I mentioned early on. We need to develop better indicators that help us really demonstrate, measure, and capture the different kinds of impacts, whether it's in policy or in practice. What are the provable effects of research that we see in terms of schooling and in terms of classroom practice? And then as a final point, I think working towards developing institutional capacity. So really developing institutional enablers that value the kind of impact that we see in practice, for example, and the kinds of engagements that we're suggesting are important to co-produce knowledge. So, working around curriculum, working around pedagogical strategies or assessment literacies, finding ways to really acknowledge, to really be able to kind of capture some of that sort of impact is going to be very important, I think. And so it's focused around staff development. And the diagram on the left is again from Bailey and Phipps, who've been fairly instrumental in our thinking around what it means to be an impact literate institution at NIE. And a lot of this work, again, is based on partnering and based on relationships with stakeholders. And so we've developed a strategic partnering framework, and by we I mean the Knowledge Mobilization Unit. And I would like to really acknowledge the work of Dr. Hua Pui Wat and Lorraine Au and other members of the Knowledge Mobilization Unit that have really been quite instrumental in moving this work forward. But it's thinking more about how we partner and the nature of our relationships and partnerships with different stakeholders. And so we have a partnership model here as well that starts with really bringing together different partners to talk about goals and readiness and deciding how they might work together. So building partnership is core to this. And I think my time is up, and I will end there with some of the references, but thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, for keeping to your time allocation. That's great. If you could just stand by, I have some questions for you at the end.
Okay.
But that was a very good beginning, and it's given us a good foundation for our next presenter. So let me now introduce our second presenter, who is Dr. Willie Renandia. Willie is a language teacher educator with extensive teaching experience in Asia. He's currently principal lecturer at the English Language and Literature Academic Group at NIE Singapore, and he teaches in particular applied linguistic courses. He's also given over 100 presentations at regional and international English language teaching conferences and published extensively in the area of second language education. Willie maintains a large language teacher professional development forum called Teachers' Voices, and if you are on Facebook, you will be able to join that group by sending a request to Willie, who administers that group. And I'm sure that if you get in touch with Willie, he will give you the link for his Facebook group page. Willie's presentation is titled A Language Teacher's Educator's Perspectives, and it's now over to you, Willie, to continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction, and also thank you, Mark, for the exciting and insightful presentation. I'll be using the research framework that you discussed just now as a basis for my presentation. But first off, let me just provide a very brief context of what we are and where we are at NIE. If you visit our website, I think you'll be able to see our tripartite mission there: inspiring learning, transforming teaching, and advancing research. And at NIE, we believe that everyone has a role to play to achieve that mission. Also at NIE, we have research faculty. We also have teaching faculty. So for research faculty, their main job is to do research, but they also do teaching as well. But for those on the teaching track, they do a bit more teaching and also a little bit more of research as well. Now, the question for me when I look at Mark's framework is, where do I fit in the knowledge building and dissemination ecology that Mark described? I think I've learned a lot from Mark's presentation. I think my vocabulary of research has expanded a great deal now. Now here is a framework again that I want to share with you. Remember the big font size there, knowledge production, all the way to system enabler. So the questions I have that I want to address and I want to share with you is this: where do I fit in? I'm a language teacher educator. Most of my job requires that I do a lot of teaching in the classroom, meeting my pre-service and also in-service teachers. Am I a knowledge generator? To some extent, yes. Especially during my early careers, I did quite a bit of this. I was involved in quite a bit of empirical and primary research. Am I a research translator? I think the answer to that is yes. I'm doing a lot of this. Knowledge breaker, not knowledge breaker, knowledge broker. I think I prefer to use the word mediator. It's a knowledge mediator. Yes, I think I'm doing quite a bit of this. And finally, as a system enabler, I think I've done this as well to a small extent. So here's the outline of my presentation, just taken directly from Mark's research framework. Three things that I want to focus on. my role as a knowledge translator, my role as a knowledge broker, and also my role as somebody who may be able to influence practice. Okay, the first one is knowledge translation. What do I do when I try to translate knowledge from what I have seen from research to my students and to teachers out there and to other language teacher educators? How does usually pass on knowledge from one person to another? I can see there are two ways of doing this. The first one is known as knowledge telling. We simply tell what it is, telling things like they are, basically. So I would look at this as information sharing. Now, I think you and I agree that information is information. Information becomes knowledge when and if and only when we do something with that piece of information and turn it into something that is usable, that is meaningful, and that is accessible to other people. And I would call that knowledge transforming. Let me talk about a little bit more about knowledge telling. Knowledge telling basically is direct retelling. This happens a lot, this happened to me as actually when I first graduated from university. I would just tell people what I heard from my lecturers, from my reading, from research that I've seen. So it's simply a direct retelling of what I know. There's heavy use of research jargons. And also there's a lot of complex language, ambiguous language that researchers use because they're talking among themselves, among researchers. And this is language that they understand. But the moment you try to explain this to other people, then you get into problem because people may not share the same language, may not share the same lingo. For example, the heavy use of research jargons, which I now tend to avoid when I speak to teachers or other language teacher educators. For example, the pretest scores are used as a covariate, and the test is using the one-tailed t-test. The alpha level is set at a certain level. Now, this is research jargons that researchers use that may not be comprehensible to teachers in the classroom. The use of complex and ambiguous language. For example, at the end of a research study, you may find something like the results paint a very complex picture of the interactions among the intervening variables and non-intervening variables. I think these are things that we understand as researchers, but I think we need to do a bit more in order to help our teachers make sense, other people make sense of what this means. So of late, I've been involved more with knowledge transforming activities. So what I would do is I would repackage what I know from research, and then I would use language that teachers can understand. I try to keep jargons to a minimum. So I would use things like where group A is slightly better than group B, instead of the experimental group is better than the control group. And I would also address, things that are of concern to teachers. I think Mark mentioned this as well. So a simple way to present, to share ideas with teachers would be the results are positive, good result, but it's not worth your time and effort. I think we need to address that issues about time and about how much effort teachers need to put in. So that is knowledge transforming and knowledge telling. Number two, knowledge brokerage. I like this term brokerage. Reminds me of the things that those stock brokers do. They knowledge broker is something that I just learned from Mark's presentation. This is how we can. This is what we can do to engage stakeholders to reach out to a wider research and academic communities out there. And I will share with you 4 major activities that I do when I try to share, to reach out to the educational communities out there through journal writing, through conferencing, through making happy use of the media, and also through direct communication. Let me just explain one at a time. Journal. Okay, everyone has a choice. If you're a researcher, you may want to go for research-oriented journals. I'm very clear about what I do. I'm a language teacher educator. I'm very much into translating research into practice. That's why what I do is I publish my work in practice-oriented journals. Now, these are some of the examples that I usually send my papers to. Journals in English language teaching, ELT journal, or journals like Modern English Teacher, the ELT journal, and other similar journals out there. These are all practice-oriented journals. I avoid publishing in research journals like Applied Linguistics, for example. I mean, this is an example of journals that researchers usually go for to get their research findings published. Conferences. I do quite a bit of conferencing actually, and most of our conferences are usually in Asia because I see that there is a huge need of people, colleagues and friends from Asia to to understand a bit more, to be able to make sense of what is out there in terms of research published in academic journals, for example. So these are two examples of conferences in Asia that I gave presentation to. Starting last year, I began, as I said, I usually do my conferences in Asia, but starting last year, I started to branch out, to reach out to a bigger audience. I went to the States, to California, and I gave a presentation there. And apparently, some of the people there were impressed by my presentation, and they invited me back again this year. And later this year, I'll be giving a keynote presentation at the California TESOL conference. I think that is something that I am very happy and proud about. Recently, during the COVID-19, you may have seen a lot of online conferences. And I have been involved in a number of high profile and high impact, if you ask me, in terms of number of people who came and attended the conferences. Now, these are some of the examples. Webinars organized by big universities in China. Now, in terms of number, it's quite huge. We are talking about 5,000 and 10,000 people actually watching the events on, using a live stream platform. So these are conferences in China, which make me really very happy because for the first time I was able to reach out to a wider group of people from one of the biggest countries in the world. And this one I'm very proud also. This one happened earlier this month in August. This is a conference, online conference organized by a university, a public university in Indonesia. The event was intended for the whole faculty members, and quite a sizable number of the faculties actually turn out. Now, what I want to share here is this. I was able to convince them to invite all NIE people to give presentations at that conference. So you see there Mark Bailden and Yang Pedong and Nan Ho and also Lei Hun, all NIE people. And I think that has a lot of more direct impact on the people who were attending the conference. Next one is about media outreach. I'm still on the outreach brokerage, knowledge brokerage activity. As Phil mentioned early on, I make heavy use of Facebook groups, and I'm very proud of my Facebook groups. The first one is Teacher Voices. I started this group about 10 years ago, and now membership stands at more than 11,000. And these are English language teaching professionals from like 50 or 60 different countries in the world. And this is how I reach out to them. I share what I know about English language teaching, and I exchange ideas with them as well. I also reach out to people through online repository websites like academia.edu, ResearchGate, and recently I created my own website. It's called Willy's ELT Corner, where I write blogs, and I also put all my pre-published papers and also book chapters in that website for people to access. Finally is direct communication. Now, this is something that probably is unique to me, but I would encourage you to do the same as well. Once you have published a piece of paper or a book chapter, you may want to share what you have published with people that you know. And this is what I've been doing. your friends, key stakeholders. I happen to know quite a number of people in the region. These are head of departments, deans, and other appointment holders, and I would send my papers to them. But before I send them, I need to make sure that I have the right information, the right thing to say to them, and how you might want, or they might want to use the information from my papers or from my chapters. I would also send my papers to renowned scholars. Now, this is a very important thing. If renowned scholars get access to your papers, and if they do read your papers, eventually they may also mention your papers in their work as well. Finally, the last one is system enabler of impact. I've also been involved, and I would say that the impact is still quite limited, but I'm getting there, and I will be doing a lot more of this in the future. Now, these are three major things that I've been doing in order to be able to influence policymakers and also stakeholders, important stakeholders in schools and in universities and also in education. First one is curriculum consultancy. I think this is very interesting because you are working with people who develop curriculum and syllabuses, and if they take in your input, then chances are your ideas will get translated and used in the classroom. I've been doing this for the Ministry of Education. Recently, I was involved with a number of my colleagues, providing input and insights on the new English language curriculum, especially the section on reading and vocabulary. And recently, I was also invited to give comments and insights on a curriculum, an intensive language curriculum developed by a new university in Vietnam, which I did. And I was so happy that they adopted the recommendations that I gave them. So you can see the link here between what I know from research and how my ideas can potentially get translated into the classroom. The last point that I have there on my screen is kind of interesting. I've been doing this sometimes as somebody who is invited, but very often I volunteered my service to people. I think it goes both ways. Nowadays, I don't wait for people to invite me, but I would also approach them and ask them if there's anything that I could do to help them, rework or relook or review their curriculum. I've also been involved in high impact workshops. I think I need to make a distinction between low impact and high impact. What I'm describing here is impact in terms of number and impact also in terms of influence of the workshop to the people who are attending the workshop. A low impact workshop will be a one-off thing. You have a group of students, for example, a group of teachers, you come in, you provide, you give your workshop, and that's goodbye. Now, this is what I've been doing the past few years. I was involved in a multi-city workshop in Indonesia, presenting, promoting, telling people about the importance of extensive reading in language education. We went to like 5 or 6 different cities and we were able to reach out to 1,000 teachers. Now I can say that now a lot more people in Indonesia know or have heard about extensive reading and how it can be applied in their language teaching. The next one is also kind of interesting. This is what I mean by high impact workshop. Initially, I was invited to give a, one session workshop for graduate students, MA and PhD students of a university in Indonesia. And I said to them, okay, I'm interested, but is it possible for your faculty members to also attend the workshop? And I gave the reason why it is important. Because as a result of my workshop, then the students and the faculty can work together, and the faculty can provide the kind of supervision that I covered in my workshop. So I call that a high impact workshop. And finally, there's another type of workshop that I've been doing in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in some other places. And the purpose of the workshop is very clear. I would like these universities to adopt an extensive reading program in their English language programs. And some have been successful. Some universities are actually adopting or implementing extensive reading in their program. And finally, this is, I think, what Mark means by co-production of knowledge. So I make it a point to work together, to do research together, to write together with emerging scholars for buy-in, basically. I want them to be convinced that, hey, this idea is good. I want also to help them grow academically and professionally through doing joint publication with me. I have also been writing and publishing with top scholars. And for me, this is very important. This is what high impact, for high impact and high visibility. If you include a top scholar in the field as your co-author, then chances are people will also be more inclined to look at your papers. Ladies and gentlemen, when you see the word finally, then you know that I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I would like you to look at the NIE mission again: inspiring learning, transforming teaching, and advancing research. At NIE, we have a very strong team who work together to produce and disseminate knowledge in order to achieve our mission. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Willie, for sharing your perspectives and activities. Can I just remind everyone that if you have any questions in relation to Willie's presentation, or in fact Mark's as well, then can you please post them in the live event Q&A box, and we will be able to curate and hopefully address those in the discussion later on. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third presenter. Professor Christine Goh is an applied linguist who began her career as a teacher of English, literature and geography. She received her PhD in linguistics from Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Her experience includes English for academic purposes in tertiary contexts, teacher education, and university teaching and research supervision. She is the President's Chair of the Education, Linguistics and Language Education, and the Director of the National Institute of Education, which is part of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Christine's main interests are in bilingual and second language oracy, spoken discourse, metacognition in language learning, and language teacher cognition. She has a wide portfolio of publications comprising of journal papers, books, and book chapters. She's a widely cited author and has been invited to speak at many international conferences, where she also often conducts workshops for language teachers to help them apply theory and research into their teaching. So over to you, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all my colleagues in Singapore, as well as to colleagues who are not in Singapore, in other countries. Thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. What I'm going to talk about today is what do practitioners want? Now, you have heard both Mark Belden as well as William Renandia talk about making research accessible and meaningful. So what I'm going to do is to continue from there and to bring in a more personal perspective of my understanding of what practitioners want, and also how we can make research accessible and meaningful for them. So my experience is, I started off as a teacher, but I've also had lots of opportunities to interact with teachers, as a teacher educator, both through my courses in NIE as well as through international interactions like conferences, workshops, and so on. And in my role as an academic leader, I also have the opportunity to interact with lots of other practitioners, decision makers, policymakers. So it's from this perspective that I'm coming to try to unpack what this theme of the conference today, making research accessible and meaningful for practitioners. So this is the outline of my talk. What researchers and practitioners want: accessible and meaningful research, and I will end with personal reflections drawing on my own experience over the past many years as a practitioner as well as a researcher. So before we ask ourselves the question, what do practitioners want? I think it's very important for us to also ask the question, what do researchers want? Now, putting on the researcher's hat, I think researcher wants to investigate, identify topics that we're interested in, we're passionate about, that we see is an up and coming area that we can contribute to. We also want to have access to research sites and participants. We want to do cutting edge original research. We also want to be able to publish in tier 1 journals. We want to be able to publish books and book chapters by renowned publishers. But I think most of all is we need to ask ourselves the question of impact, because research should have an impact. So what kind of impact do you or do I as a researcher want to make? Now, the impact does not have to be limited to just one kind. As a researcher, we would want to make impact perhaps in different areas. But since we're talking about making research accessible and meaningful to practitioners, I want to focus on making an impact on practice. Now, in order to do this, we need to then ask ourselves the questions, what do practitioners want? And again, putting on the hat of a practitioner, as well as a teacher educator, as well as somebody who has had the privilege of interacting with decision makers, as well as with many very experienced teachers in my own graduate classes. As somebody like that, and also to my conversation, I think practitioners want several things. One is they want research that gives them answers to questions about practice, something that is very close to their heart, very close on the ground. Perhaps they see a problem with their practice or a problem with the students' learning. They want research to be able to speak to these things and understanding of how to help my students. So as a practitioner, I think these are two very important things that research must do for me. Also, because there's so little time as a teacher, for example, I want to know what's the best practice now or the best pedagogy. I think we know there really isn't such a thing as the best pedagogy, but I think practitioners do want to know something that is effective, that has been trialed and tested, and something that perhaps will apply to their situation. Now, practitioners also include curriculum and material developers. So they want to know, what are the principles based on research that I can draw on to inform my writing of the curriculum or to inform my writing of the material. But last but not least, and I've got 2 points here, research partnership is what teachers and practitioners want. And this has been alluded to, especially by Mark Belden in his first talk. I think teachers and practitioners participate in research that we organize because they want to help and they want to find reasons and answers that will help them in their own practice. But actually, practitioners also want to be a partner in making the decisions, in coming up with research questions, in thinking about what are some of the issues that researchers, perhaps from a university, should think about. And finally, researchers, teachers or practitioners may also want to do their own research. So these are some things that I think practitioners want. Now, based on these, I'm going to just look at this as a summary for this part, which is researchers, practitioners want clarity. They want researchers to be able to tell them what is it about the research that speaks to my situation. They want to be able to understand what the researcher is saying. Just now, Willie talked about the jargon that researchers use. And we do have our own register when we are publishing in journals. If you're publishing a quantitative study, for example, there's a whole register that is accepted and is expected in the academic community. And it's the same for qualitative research and so on. But it is in the communication of the findings and perhaps even the process that the teachers want clarity in, and even other practitioners such as curriculum writers and also policymakers. Relevance is particularly important. How is this piece of study relevant to me as a practitioner? What does it tell me about my situation, about my students? So this is what's going to make it meaningful. They also want partnership and guidance. for those who want to understand research more, they want some help in understanding maybe even the register of researchers. Now, there are different kinds of practitioners. There are practitioners who want to just keep to their practice and they want researchers to tell them and recommend procedures and pedagogies to them. But there are also practitioners who are interested in doing their own research and understanding and consuming research and also co-creating the knowledge. So they need partnership and they need guidance. So based on what I have said here, I would like to then summarize this part about accessible and meaningful research. So research that is generated from universities can have different kinds of effect. As I mentioned earlier, researchers want certain things and practitioners also want certain things, but they aren't always the same things. One of the problems with research, as mentioned earlier, is that it is not accessible because there is a problem of communication. So the expression, the description of the research, of the findings, may not be in the language that practitioners are comfortable with. On the other hand, it could also be that the researchers may be making an attempt to do that, but because of a lack of prior knowledge about certain kinds of research and theory, the practitioners may also find it difficult to comprehend what is being shared. So there's a problem of communication. So even though something may be relevant, meaningful, but it's not accessible, it is going to be not going to have the effect that we want as researchers. Then we also have, of course, the problem of relevance. We have lots of good research out there. Not everybody is interested in every piece of research. I think what is important is for each of us as researchers to think about what is this in my field that I think practitioners would be interested in. Let me have a conversation with some of them whom I know, or look at the kind of questions that are asked in social media by teachers' social media groups. What are some of the things that they're interested in? So the problem of relevance can actually be addressed. Sometimes we do research because we are so passionate about it, and at the end of the day, we find that it may not have the kind of impact that we want because practitioners may not see it as directly speaking to their problem or to their practice situation. Now we want to hit that sweet spot, something that is clear and relevant. Research that is done well, but also communicated well, and also other people like the practitioners find relevant. And finally, when our research is not meaningful and not accessible, it has no impact on practice. Of course, I'm not talking about research that is very upstream, where the impact is on theory and on other matters. But if we as researchers want our research to have some impact on practice, then we got to make sure that our research, our communication of our research and our engagement with practitioners make it accessible as well as meaningful. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to a couple of examples from my own experience. Accessibility and meaningfulness, some personal reflections. As I prepared this, I tried to think back to many episodes in my career as a teacher, as a graduate student, as a teacher educator, researcher, and also as an academic leader. But I'll just focus on my reflection as an individual researcher. Now, I had a year where there was a change in the way I viewed research. And I call it my epiphany. And this was in 1991 when I was doing my Master of Arts in Applied English Linguistics in the University of Birmingham. I'd always been very interested in pronunciation, but as some of you may know, that Birmingham is very well known for the discourse approach to language studies. So I was very taken up by the discourse approach to studying of pronunciation, which in this case is the study of discourse intonation. I have read papers on pronunciation, on intonation, on the way it's been described. But when I studied this course, it wasn't done by David Brazil, but by David Brazil's student, Martin Hewings. And as I read the book on the left, right, that is the original monograph. I began to see that, wow, this is such a deep and substantial topic, and yet David Brazil was able to make it so relevant to a language teacher like myself. And more than that, he also made the process so easy. Instead of having to transcribe and transcribe and use certain kind of conventions that I found was very difficult, he came up with such an easy, straightforward, but no less rigorous way of transcribing intonation patterns in speech. I think that really changed me, although it wasn't that particular moment. But on reflection, when I was taking this course, it did something to my life as a researcher, as a teacher, as an academic. And I guess from then onwards, I began to think about research in a slightly different light. That I want to do research that is going to have an impact on practice. And I want to try my best to make sure that I communicate it as best as I can, so that the practitioners will know what I'm trying to tell them, and they will not find that I am hiding behind hedges and also jargon. So let me share a couple of examples here. Now, some of you in English language would know that in 2001, Singapore rolled out a new syllabus, EL syllabus 2001. Now, prior to that, I've actually published a book on managing change in English language teaching with Chris Kennedy and Paul Doyle. And so this idea about managing change was very fresh in my mind. And I wanted to know how Singapore was managing this implementation of the new syllabus. And what I wanted to do was to focus on only the teacher cognition aspect. So I got a couple of colleagues and we got a grant and we did the research. And after that, I made a decision that the first people we want to reach out to with these is not the journal reviewers, but it is the practitioners. These are the teachers, the school leaders, as well as the officers who are taking charge of curriculum. So I printed, using my grant money, I printed many hard copies. At that time, PDF circulation wasn't so popular yet. And send them off to schools and also send them off to units of work that I believe has the scope of influence. And I was so delighted that one day when I was at a meeting, at a review meeting of this syllabus, this particular publication, monograph, research monograph, was mentioned by the most senior person in that division. And the person was saying, actually, I asked school leaders to read this book because there is so much in there to tell us about our syllabus and to tell us about the way teachers think and enact syllabus. So I felt that it was because I took that decision to write it in a way where the language is accessible and also presented the findings in a way that practitioners find it very easy to read right through. I found that it was because of that this particular publication got noticed. And it was eventually in the review of the 2001 syllabus that this particular publication was referenced very heavily. I also work in the field of metacognition, and some of the things that I wanted to do was to ensure that theory that I work with can be easily understood by practitioners. So what I did was I distilled the readings and also went through the contestations of constructs. And we know that, as researchers, we know that in certain constructs are not, you don't have one particular explanation for it. People are still debating. But I went back to the original readings by John Flavel, and I read as many of the original publications as I could, and I teased out this framework. And this was used in the book that Larry van der Grift and I published. I also tried to use and apply some of the principles into pedagogical sequences in the classroom. So these are just some examples of how my colleague Larry van der Grift and I teased out research-informed principles and put them in visuals, in charts, in graphs that we can communicate directly to teachers. And this is another example where I used the research, not just my own research, but the research of other researchers, and aggregated that, teased them out, found what was most suitable, and repackaged it as Billy said, in what I call the teaching speaking cycle, for curriculum developers to develop a speaking program and for teachers to refer to. And finally, the last strategy I used was, research tools that practitioners can use. Very often we use tools to get data, but actually we ask ourselves, some of these tools can be used by practitioners. And this particular questionnaire, the MALC as we call it, is something that has been used a lot by both researchers as well as practitioners, because I constantly, since publication, get emails asking for advice and so on. And Larry and I actually published an interpretation guide to go along with it to help practitioners interpret the findings. So I'm going to end here. So I want to come back to this point about, as researchers, how do we make our research meaningful and accessible? I think we want to try to hit that sweet spot, understand what practitioners want, practitioners in our field, for example, what do they want, and think about ways to communicate the findings that practitioners will find useful for them, for their practice, and for their students. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Can I also ask you to stand by? There have been several questions that have been sent in that I'd like to ask you to address later on. We're now moving into the discussion part of today's webinar, and I'm very pleased to say that we have a full basket of questions that have come in over the past hour or so. And what I'm going to try and do is to consolidate some of those and to pass them out for people on the panel to try and respond to. And hopefully I'll be able to cover as much of the ground that has been questioned as far as I can in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first question is for Mark. Mark, in your presentation, you were talking about knowledge challenges, knowledge opportunities, knowledge building, and also knowledge mobilization. I wonder whether you have any comments to make about how these areas might be impacted by the current working from home and COVID-19 restrictions, if you like, if I can call them that, and whether or not our current situation might be affected by the kind of knowledge work that we can do when we're not meeting many people face to face on a regular basis. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. I think that it makes this sort of knowledge framework even more important. And I think, especially in terms of maybe knowledge translation work, I think, making sure that we have knowledge resources that are very useful for practitioners is really core. And I think following, Willie's and Christine's suggestions of, making sure that these are sort of actionable resources that teachers can use. From talking to teachers and actually school leaders, they keep saying to me that they want ASCD type materials that do provide a little bit of background in terms of maybe theory and core principles, but they want things that are quite actionable that they can put into practice. And I think we have to get sharper at doing that kind of work, that we make available some of those resources online that they can download and use in their classroom practice. I think the second thing is, I think that it makes knowledge brokerage and so on even more important, because it's really connecting people up in online communities, as needed. And I think it's getting people to the right kinds of resources and even expertise. And I think we're seeing that, things like webinars can be quite powerful for bringing people together in a community that has a shared interest. But I think maybe, rethinking how do we engage people in these online forums? How do we create more workshops where people have more opportunities to talk and make sense of research and think about the implications of research and maybe share what they've been doing in their classrooms. So I do think that, a lot of this can be moved sort of into an online space where we're partnering with people, where we're bringing people together to talk about shared problems, where we're collaboratively kind of making sense and engaging in some form of collaborative inquiry. So I would hope that it actually demonstrates kind of the value of this framework, that we can think through what this might mean in different kinds of online spaces, even though we can't do it face to face.
Sure, but I guess the point is this: is that don't you think that from a kind of like an epistemological point of view, that the nature of knowledge itself is being transformed or changed by the very fact that we're now working online and not interacting with each other so much face to face?
Yeah, I think it definitely is, and I think that's why we need to rethink kind of the nature of the knowledge and these different kinds of pathways. So I think there's a lot of room for us to explore what that might mean. Which I think is, again, it kind of points to this need for maybe experimentation and investigation and kind of this continual engagement to keep making sense. Is this working for us? Is this knowledge useful? Am I able to actually apply it? So yeah, I guess in terms of the transforming of knowledge, I'll have to think through that one. That's a really I think interesting question. Yeah, what does that mean? What does that look like in terms of knowledge and whether it's transformed? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I can't at the moment I can't provide a quick answer to that, but I think I'll have to think through it a bit more. Thanks.
Oh dear, I didn't want to put you on the spot, and I wasn't expecting an immediate answer, but it does provide me with a bit of a segue into the next question that I have for Willie, relating to how we fit into your framework that you presented. So Willie asked that question, how do we fit into that framework, and adopting these different roles as knowledge mediator, as broker, and so on. So the question for you, Willie, that's come from several members of the audience is that colleagues have noted that you're a very experienced and knowledgeable practitioner in your own right. But what if you're just starting out? I mean, what can you do to start making an impact if you've never had any chance to do this kind of thing before?
Very interesting. I think it takes quite a bit of learning, quite a bit of a process actually to get from where you are to where you want to be. Let me just share with you my experiences when I was younger. During my early days, I tended to believe everything that people said to me. Not everybody, but my former professors, information from journal articles, from research papers, I tended to believe. But gradually I began to realize that, hey, these ideas are good, but as he said, sometimes doesn't apply to me. So gradually I began to develop my own criteria for assessing information, for reviewing information, to what extent the information is useful. I'm going to share with you 3 things that I've been using to assess the usability of information or knowledge from research. The first one is theoretical adequacy. I'm using a big word now, theoretical adequacy. The second one is experiential relevance. And the third one is pedagogical applicability. The first one is very important, theoretical relevance. How good is the theory? Is that the only theory out there? Are there any other people who may or may disagree with whoever, the person who introduced the theory? So that is something that people can start thinking about. Theoretical adequacy. Is the theory sound? Is it good? Number 2 is very important, your own relevance. Do you go through the same experience? Do people that you know also can say that, yes, the theory makes sense because I go through the same experience as well? And then finally, as an educator, I always looking for the last one, educational applicability. How relevant is this for practice? So three points that I am now using as a basis for assessing, and also for using, and also for translating, and also for influencing other people when I come across a piece of new knowledge. So it takes time, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good point. It takes time, but I guess that if I might take a shot at trying to summarize what you said and turn it into sort of actionable items, it seems to me then is that what's important here is the kind of like a scholarly perspective or outlook on what it is that we're doing, and that we need to have some, would you agree, some elements of criticality that we need to apply to our own practices?
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
Criticality, and again, it takes time. You can't really be critical to something that you have just learned. I mean, it takes time to really, reflect on it and see to what extent what people are saying actually is applicable to you, applicable to the students that you're teaching, applicable to people from different contexts of learning.
Sure. So I guess that, I guess that what you've got to do then is if it does take time to build these things up, some of these kind of like softer skills that we might not always relate to the work that we do, but suddenly become important. For example, like reflecting on what we do, reading beyond our immediate fields in order to get new ideas and perspectives from other people, trying to talk or interact with others as far as possible, all seem to be good things that we can start doing in order to get going with this kind of enterprise.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I was reminded of this distinction between people who have supposedly closed mindset and people who have growth mindset. I think that's very important for people, for me, for you, for everyone, to have this idea that we can all grow, we can all learn new things if we are willing to listen to people and if we're willing to learn from other people. The growth mindset is a big thing in education nowadays.
Sure. Okay, thanks, Willie. The next question is for Christine. Christine, there have been many comments made about your presentation, and it's going to be hard to try and drill it down to just one issue that you can start off with. But perhaps I can try and do it like this. You spoke about impact and making an impact, but the question that many have is this: what is evidence of impact, and how can it perhaps be measured? So, traditionally, we've always thought of as researchers that trying to target journals with high impact factors is the gold standard, if you like, of a researcher's work. Well, what about if you're a teacher in a classroom and you don't have many people that you can interact with or that you can research? How can you work then in those kinds of ways and demonstrate impact on a small scale?
Thanks, Phil. Okay, I think first of all, the word impact can be applied to many situations. In the university context, traditionally, impact is linked to metrics, right? So your citation numbers, your Hirsch index, and so on. And it's still one objective way of looking at how many people actually read your papers, cite your papers, because that in itself does talk about the impact of your research, how far-reaching it is. But impact is also measured in qualitative ways. So your question is, how do we gather evidence for that? Of course, anything that's qualitative is more complex, and some people would say it's subjective. But to my mind, impact would mean, in education, as an educator, impact would mean, how does my work influence the thinking of the teachers, of the curriculum developers, and so on? And in the way they develop their work, does it reflect my thinking? Does it reflect what I have been explaining and championing? And if they take on board some, right, if not all, but mainly some of the recommendations, for example, that I have made, then I would say, yes, that's some kind of impact. And that is important impact, and also depending on at which level the recommendations is implemented. But for teachers in school, the impact is even closer to home. The impact is on your students. If you read a piece of research and it resonates with you, and as Willie has said, it applies to your situation, applies to your colleague situation, and it resonates with you, and you try it out, and your students may not immediately become very good the next week or the next semester, but it does change the way, for example, they view a learning process. So from my own example is I do a lot of work in second language listening, and if I take a very strictly empirical or quantitative view of things, then I would have to set up pre and post, and people would say, you know, if you do metacognitive intervention and if your post intervention does not give you a significant change in the results, that means it's not effective. But I always argue that in language development, it is really like slow food. You don't see impact, you don't see results overnight or even in the semester, but you will. It is like planting a seed and slowly let it grow. So impact can be very visual in terms of numbers, but impact can also be in the way your students are motivated. So in listening, the students are actually more motivated in introspecting on what they have been going through and in developing ways of monitoring the way they learn and develop. So that to me is impact, and that is huge impact for a teacher.
Yes, thank you. Mark, I'll get to you in a moment, but I just want to say, I think another important site for impact for me is kind of like a personal impact in terms of the kind of things that I'm interested in and the kinds of things that I do as a researcher. So I'm kind of like, you know, often we look outside of ourselves for, you know, evidence of impact, but I actually try and think about looking inwards and seeing, you know, how we're changing personally in relation to the kinds of things that we're trying to study.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with you, Phil, because as whether we're researchers or practitioners, you know, we are all professionals, and whatever that we encounter should have some influence or some impact on the way we grow as a person, as a professional. That is important impact. Agree with you, absolutely.
Thank you. Mark, you had a comment you wanted to make?
Just very quickly, just to follow up from your idea, you know, I think it's important to document as well, you know, how these changes are taking place in terms of how we think or how we teach. And I think we're moving towards, you know, trying to possibly do case studies. So going into classrooms and talking to teachers, talking to students, observing, you know, I think one of the things is that there's a lot of there's a lot of different kinds of things that impact classroom practice. And I think case studies allow for that sort of richer, kind of more nuanced picture of some of the changes that are taking place in classrooms, and kind of being on the ground and talking to people and learning more about how they're using, you know, making use of research is something that we're hoping to do. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Okay, Willie, yes.
Yes, this very small addition to what has been shared by Mark and also Christian. I am currently a founding member, and also an executive board member of a foundation. This is an international foundation called the Extensive Reading Foundation. And our mission is very clear. We want to make everyone in the world a reader, basically. Very, very idealistic. So what we've been doing for the past few years is to put together research ideas and then try to influence education, people in education, to actually implement and apply reading, extensive reading, in their classrooms. And I think we have been successful to some extent. So it's really joyful when you see people get persuaded. I mean, important people in education, they get persuaded and they actually implement extensive reading as a course or as a part of the curriculum. So I think I can see very clearly the impact of what we do in terms of practice. But in terms of whether actually the students make improvement in language learning or in language development, like Kristen says, it takes time. So we need 1 year, we need 2 years to see the fruit of our effort, whether or not students eventually develop a higher level of literacy in English or in other languages.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Azzy now. Stand by for that. You were talking about trying to reinforce research and practice initiatives. And Mark and others spoke to about trying to find this sweet spot between research and practice. So the question that I'm trying to consolidate here is, look, if we're in search of this sweet spot, what is worth looking at? How do we decide on where we focus our attention, and how much effort do we need to put into those things? What would motivate us to get involved in some research? For example, somebody has mentioned not STEM, but STEAM. science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. What are your views on these things?
All right, thanks, Phil. So I think there are two questions that you've just posed to me. The first one would be trying to find the sweet spot between how research and practices is impactful, right, for our various contexts. And the second one would be the development of this STEAM field in relation to probably some of the neuroscientific advances in education. So
Yes.
I'll probably address the first one. And I think earlier when I alluded to the Pastor's quadrant, where there seems to be this privileging of research and application work that's situated in Pastor's quadrant. But I think reflecting personally on my experience, I didn't start off with this primacy on quadrant occupancy, but rather as I journey through the research, interacting with teachers and practitioners and listening to their needs and listening to some of the very integral struggles that they face on the ground, the idea of finding that sweet spot really becomes something that's oriented towards a more realistic, diverse, and productive goals. So I remember in conversations with some of my more experienced colleagues in NIE, I think there was always this strong advice for us to balance our educators' heart as well as the harsh realities of academia. So on one hand, while we try to create some kind of impactful research on the ground, I think there's also this need to attend to some of the expectations that we need to show in terms of what Professor Goh alluded to earlier in terms of the H index, in terms of the impact factor, in terms of how some of this impactful work can actually make you further grow as both a researcher as well as a practitioner in NIE. Yeah, so that's for the first question. And I think the second question would be with regards to STEAM. So in recent years, I think there's also this qualitative shift into more arts-oriented research. So we have always been aware of science, technology, and engineering and math research, but now there's also this inclusion of the A to allude to this acronym called STEAM. And I think this orientation towards including the arts in education, or to foreground some of these more qualitative aspects of learning, is really a growth or a progression towards interdisciplinarity. So earlier when I showed the slide where learning sciences in itself is interfacing with so many other fields, and I think moving forward, the kinds of domains that we are working with, the kinds of research that we are engaging with, or even the kinds of practitioner work that we are doing, it entails a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations. And having said that, I think STEAM values both the proficiency of knowledge and understanding through perhaps more qualitative kinds of approaches like guiding student inquiry, dialogue, and critical thinking. So in terms of the neuroscientific aspects of STEAM work, I think there has been a body of work, cognitive psychologists, neuroscientists, for example, there's a body of work in the literature that has shown how the arts improve certain learning outcomes, such as participant retention, or recalling through semantic elaboration, or generation of information, enactment, oral production. I think there's also this whole other aspect of creativity in terms of enacting higher order cognitive skill. So some of the neuroscientific work in terms of collecting neural data, so for example, if we use an EEG scanner that actually collects electrical scalp activity, there has been studies that show EEG results that show novel brain patterns that are associated with creative thinking. And of course, as I alluded to earlier, I think every teaching endeavor, or every practitioner endeavor, is an empirical process in itself. So while we may have some of these findings that are being published in the literature, I think it's also an opportunity for us to move forward and advance the field by trying it in various contexts, and just to augment further and to deepen the basic scientific fundamental understanding of some of these STEAM areas.
Okay, thank you, Azzy. Unfortunately, our time has run down, and I just think I'd like to end by asking each of our panelists for a final comment. Maybe there's something that you'd like to underline in your presentation or in the short discussion that we've had. Just some final comments from each of you, beginning with Mark, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this notion of research impact literacy is really an important one, and I think it's thinking about our own practices in terms of trying to make research more accessible and meaningful for different audiences, and what that requires of us in terms of the ways we use language, the ways we work with different stakeholders. And so, you know, I think that's an important concept at both an individual researcher level, but also at the institutional level, in thinking about how we can support, you know, this really important work and give it sort of equal standing as, you know, the traditional metrics in the university that Christine has talked about. So, you know, I think that would be my parting words is, you know, I think this can be a very concerted effort on the part of the whole institution and organization. And I hope that we can move in that direction. Thanks.
Good. Willie, a final comment from you?
Yes. I think I mentioned this in my presentation that every single one of us has a role to play in this whole big idea, ecology of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination. Whether you are a researcher or a teacher. A researcher does a lot more research, a teacher does a lot more teaching, but there's somebody in the middle who will need to translate research into practice so that the link becomes clearer, so that we can achieve our mission of building a closer link between theory, research, and practice.
Thank you. Thank you. Christine.
Okay, I know we have been talking in terms of practitioners and researchers, but actually in between, we do have a group of professionals who are both practitioners and researchers. And I think it is this particular group of professionals that's going to have a very important role to play in being that bridge. Sometimes, to be honest, the researcher himself or herself may not be that bridge that is needed and may not be an effective bridge. But increasingly, in many countries, we see teachers, curriculum developers taking on research. So they have the research mindset, but at the same time, they also have a heart that is so close to the ground. So I believe that it is this group of professionals that is going to play a very, very big part in the days to come as more and more of teachers and practitioners take on research and at the same time think about the applications in the classroom and elsewhere.
Thank you so much. And finally, Azzy, a short final comment from you.
Yeah, a short one. Yeah, I think I would just like to highlight two aspects, and one is the interdisciplinary nature of research moving forward. So we could be in our respective domains, but I think to advance this whole field of scientific advancements into education, there needs to be a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations, educators with neuroscientists, with cognitive researchers, with psychologists. And the other one would be what the other panel members have highlighted, and that would be with regards to the intercollaborations, the importance of the human factor in advancing this agenda forward for us to really achieve our goal of a future of education.
Right. Thank you very much. And thanks to you all for your insightful comments and for your sharing this morning. So let me just end with a couple of final housekeeping announcements. The first is that at OER and at NIE more generally, we're really interested in getting feedback on the work that we do. And you can now see displayed on the screen a QR code and also a URL that you can click on and you can give us your feedback in a short online form. We'd really appreciate this information. It helps us to think about the work that we do and how we're reaching out to the community and our colleagues. And it also helps us to plan for the future as well. So if you can spend just a few precious moments filling in that feedback form, that will be very useful for us. Secondly, Many people this morning have asked whether or not we will be issuing an e-certificate for participation in this morning's event. Unfortunately, we won't be doing that. Instead, if you let us know your email address in the feedback form, we will very happily send you an email confirming your attendance and participation in today's webinar, and we'll be happy to do that if you let us know your email address. So with that being said, I'd like to thank the panelists for your sharing this morning once more and for a final time, and also to thank everyone who's joined us this morning from around the world and also within Singapore. We hope that this webinar has been useful and that you've learned something. There have been many questions that have come in, not only about the contents of the presentations, but other things too, and we will be happy to follow up with individual communications if you let us know who it is that we're addressing. So it's just up to me now to thank everyone once more, and I hope that you have a pleasant and peaceful rest of the weekend, and we'll see you again very shortly. Bye-bye.